I'm Lizzie with A Small Circle, and I'm going to show you how to finish your quilt using double fold bias binding. Bias binding differs from quilt binding in that it's cut at a 45-degree angle from the selvage. It's cut on the bias of the fabric. Fabric that's cut on the bias has some stretch and give to it. This allows bias binding to go around curves and odd angles really smoothly and gives you a lot of flexibility and pliability. Another benefit to bias binding is its strength and durability. With quilt binding, the warp and the weft are running horizontally and vertically in the binding. So what you have is a single thread that's running along the entire length of your quilt, and that's taking all the wear and tear on that edge. With bias binding, the warp and weft are running at 45-degree angles, and they're running across, multiple fibers are running across the edge of your quilt. And so that's creating the wear and tear will go along many fibers, making it more durable and last longer. Most pre-made binding comes in 3-yard increments, so you're most likely going to have to attach 2 or more strips together to get one piece long enough to go around the perimeter of your quilt. To attach 2 strips of binding together, you're going to need to unfold your binding and align the angled edges together, right sides together. And depending on how your binding comes out of the package, these angled edges might not line up. So you might need to cut one of your strips at an angle like that so that they will line up. But these line up. And I want the corners to overhang by about 1/4 of an inch. And you should also be getting a 90-degree angle right here. So once you have your strips lined up, you're going to take it to your machine and sew from this corner to this corner, which is going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that you've sewn that, we're going to trim these overhanging corners. And then when I open this up, your edges should at least come pretty close to aligning. This isn't perfect, but that's okay. It's not really going to affect the quilt since we're only attaching a little bit together. Then you take your binding over to your ironing board, press this seam open, and then you're going to iron the folds back into your binding. So now our binding is attached and we have a long enough strip to go all the way around our quilt. And when you buy pre-packaged binding, you'll notice that it's not actually folded exactly in half. I'm showing this to you on the gray so that you can see it, but when I actually attach the binding to my quilt, I'm going to be starting with the black. But you'll see on this double fold binding that this top half is actually narrower than the back half. There's a little bit of an overhang. And that's because we're going to attach the narrower side to the front of the quilt, and then when the longer side wraps around the back, that overhang is going to cover our stitch line from the front of the quilt. So you'll take your binding, figure out which side is narrower, unfold it, and align right sides together, raw edges of your quilt and your binding. You want to leave about 3 or 4 inches of a tail before you start sewing. And I just like to put a couple of clips on my binding. I do not clip all the way around, but I like to put clips just to get it started. And then I'm going to take this over to my machine and start sewing. So remember, we're starting a little ways away from the tail end of the binding, and you're going to line your needle up either directly on that first crease line or just a little bit inside the crease line. I like to line my needle up just a little bit inside the crease line, so I'm going to bump it over a little bit. And you want to backstitch here And then you're on your way. Now we're coming up on our first corner, and I've rounded the corners on this quilt so that I can show you what bias binding can do. Because binding has that flexibility to go around curves so well, there really isn't anything special you have to do to it. The main thing to keep in mind is not to pull on it while you're going around that curve. You just want to lay it flat and keep it as relaxed as possible. And if you need to, you can always put your needle down and lift up your presser foot and kind of adjust things as you're making your way around that curve. Now I've sewn all the way around this quilt, and I'm approaching where we first started sewing the binding. So go back to that first tail, unfold it all the way, and you're going to fold it back at about a 45-degree angle right there. You can pin that if you want, or you can just hold it in place. I'll stick a pin in it. And then here's the end of my binding. And I'm just going to lay it straight over the top of the beginning of the binding, still lined up with the edge of the quilt. And then we're going to just continue sewing all the way past where we first started sewing the first time. And then you can take your quilt out of your sewing machine and trim those threads. So we finished attaching the front of the binding to the quilt, and you'll see that the stitching to attach the front of the binding goes in the first fold of the double fold binding. The second fold is what's going to go around the raw edge, and then the third fold you leave folded so that all of your raw edges will be enclosed. And then over on the back of your quilt, you'll see that that thicker half of the binding neatly covers the stitching from the front of your quilt. There's nothing different about securing bias binding to the back of your quilt than when you're using bias cut on the grain, and there are several ways to do it. My favorite way is to hand stitch using the same stitch that I used for hand quilting. You can also use a ladder stitch for an invisible finish, or you can even just go ahead and finish it on your machine if you like that look. I'm going to show you how to hand stitch your binding to the back of your quilt. So now for our hand stitching, I've prepared several lengths of the same thread that I used for the quilting, And I'm going to use the exact same stitch that I used to do the hand quilting. So I'm going to put my needle in, get it under the backing fabric and the batting, but I'm not going to poke it through to the other side. Bring it out about 1 inch away, and I'm just going to sink my knot underneath those layers, and this is going to be hidden when that binding folds over to the back. Then I'll bring my needle up through just the very edge of the binding. And now I'm simply going to use my quilting stitch to attach the binding to the quilt. And periodically I'm going to check the front of my quilt to make sure that my stitches are below this binding. If you don't care if your stitches are on the binding on the front of the quilt, it doesn't matter. I like my stitches to be just below the binding. And we're just going to continue that all the way around our quilt. I've finished attaching the binding to my quilt, and I love the way that it turned out. I really like these curved, cozy corners that the flexibility of bias binding allowed me to do, and I also really like the durability of this quilt, that it can be used every day. I hope that you've found this tutorial helpful, and if you have a project that you'd like to use double fold bias binding on, I hope you'll check out my website where I have all kinds of prints and solids to choose from. It's thesmallcircle.shop. Thanks again for watching.